Hi, welcome to the 8th office hour for the MOOC on Environmental Security and Sustaining Peace. I'm Carl Bruch, and I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm here with Alexander Verbeek. Alexander is a Dutch environmentalist, public speaker, diplomat, former strategic policy advisor, and overall leader in the field of environmental security and particularly climate security. Over the past 29 years, he's worked on international security, humanitarian and geopolitical risk factors, and the linkage to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. Currently, Alexander is on leave from the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he is serving as policy director at the Environment and Development Resource Center in Brussels. He also works internationally as an expert speaker and advisor on planetary change to academia, global NGOs, private firms, and international organizations. Alexander led the creation of the Planetary Security Initiative. I think it's probably safe to say he created the Planetary Security Initiative, which is held annually at the Hague's Peace Palace. And on the order of 75 countries, participants come every year to exchange lessons and develop strategies for addressing the climate change and security relationship. Alexander is an influential leader online and in person. He particularly with respect to climate change. As of March of this year, his online following on all social media is more than 250,000 people. His main Twitter site is at @Alex_Verbeek. In 2011, he became a World Fellow at Yale University. Alexander is associate of the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Stockholm International Water Institute. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, visiting fellow in the Peace and Conflict Department at Uppsala University in Sweden, and an associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He is also on the board of advisors of several international environmental initiatives. And I should say that he's also an ambassador for the MOOC. And I'm wondering, maybe by way of framing some of your interests, curious how you came to work on the intersection between climate change and security.
I think it's a long story how I got there. By background, I've worked on security. I've been a naval officer. I worked as a diplomat several times in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the security department as part of the security committee. I worked at the OSCE. There's a lot of security, but I'm also a human geographer and always very much interested in nature. And I've done environmental work in the ministry and also at several embassies. And I was a strategic policy advisor and then connected to the environmental department. And these two issues were, in the time that I started, like two opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, if you were in the security department, you want to talk about climate change, but like, yeah, no, go to the other floor. There you got the climate people. But at a certain moment, of course, climate change and everything related to environmental degradation on a planetary scale becomes such a, is getting such an impact on security that you could no longer ignore in the security department the impact of the environment. So those, let's say the twins were finally meeting in, let's say, 2005, 2007, you saw that there was much more attention coming for it. 2007 was first debate in the Security Council about this issue. So I've been, since that time, even before that, I think, always been involved and always worked on this nexus.
So how did you come to the idea of the Planetary Security Initiative, and how did that actually come into being?
Yeah, what I noticed was that I saw initiatives, I saw experts like you working on this, and quite a few in the world, but what was missing was like one annual conference where all these experts came together. And I was surprised that it didn't exist. I was actually looking for, I want to go to such a conference, and I saw that it wasn't there. And then the other thing was that, and that was actually the thing that triggered me first, was that I had so much difficulties convincing people in the Ministry of Defense and also in the Security Department that climate change is really something that's relevant for all of us in whatever field you're working, including security. And that there wasn't one place where they could go to and get that information. So combining these two findings, I thought we'll just create a place where the experts meet each other, but where the experts can also share their expertise with policymakers.
And I think February marked the 5th Planetary Security Conference, or was
The
that
fourth
the
one.
6th? Fourth.
Yeah, we're at the fourth one.
So where is it going from here?
That's currently a debate what we are going to do. And personally, I feel that we already see some spin-offs in let's say smaller events taking place, especially in those countries that are much harder hit by climate change and by the impact of climate change on security than in The Hague, which is of course the city of international justice and peace, so therefore a good place. But I feel we should also be more out there, and I see that development already growing. We don't have a date nor a decision yet on the next one. We've had one every year, but currently, and that's up to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm no longer involved in that, so they should see how they do it. So I don't want to speculate on what they are going to do, but you could think of different options. You can either do it for some other country, you could do it somewhere else, you could just do it in The Hague as we've done it in the previous years, or you could think of different forms how you could do it. So yeah, like you, I'm eagerly awaiting for the decisions they will take there. But this is an issue that it's out there to grow, and we see the rapidly deteriorating environmental, the planetary ecosystem. We see the climate, the impacts of climate change. We see so much more of it now than just 5 years ago, and all the reports and predictions, they all go in the direction that we're bound to get more related security problems. So we need places to discuss it. That can be the regular, let's say, multilateral fora like the UN or in NATO or in the EU, and we should certainly do it there. But it also deserves a place where the experts can meet each other and talk about these issues. So we need something like that. In what form we're going to see it developing in the next year, I'm waiting just as eagerly as you what decisions will be taken there.
So there's a question from the student who had following along these lines. Relative to your time as a diplomat for the Dutch government, do you feel there are different challenges in addressing the topics of climate change and environmental security as a private citizen? So, you were in the ministry, now you're more a private citizen. Do you feel your ability to influence views and actions on this topic has changed?
Yes, certainly. I mean, first of all, you feel a kind of freedom when you're no longer a diplomat. You can really speak very free. Well, not everything. There are some subjects I don't touch, but yeah. So you have more freedom to operate. I don't have, let's say, a minister that tells me what to do or parliament that is checking what I do. So that gives opportunities. I make maximum use of that. I can now sit with you here and talk about these issues. Tomorrow I'll be in Ottawa talking about these kind of issues, and then I move on to Boulder, where I'm later next week to talk about these issues, and I can speak freely there. On the other hand, if you're part of a bigger institution, you have, let's say, the power of an institution behind you. You're representing a country, so your hands may be more tight, but you are representing something which is much bigger than you are yourself. So I think for getting this issue, giving more attention to this issue, we need a combination of both. We need diplomats that are active on this, and a number of countries, or Netherlands and Germany and Sweden are the first three that come to mind, are really active on this issue. And you need academics, and you need think tanks, and you need individuals like me that remain active, and we should all work together on this, but we play different roles. I must say I feel quite comfortable in this more independent role now, after having been diplomat for many years.
Yeah, there's a real ecosystem of actors, and you have to figure out what your niche is within that ecosystem.
You can be more creative. When you're alone, you can just take some new initiative and work on it. We were here yesterday in Washington. That's the reason why I'm here now, for setting up a transatlantic dialogue about the challenges of the 21st century. So we take Canada and the US, probably Mexico, and have representatives there, not necessarily from government, it could be, but you can think country where we are now, that maybe we find more enthusiasm among academics, or maybe at city or state level. And then we have a debate with what's happening in Europe. There's a lot of cooperation, a lot of things we can learn from each other. So that's one of those initiatives that EDRC has developed and that we are working on now.
I've in a number of seminars, events, workshops in the last year, I've heard a variety of concerns about securitizing or militarizing climate change. Do you really want the military or the Security Council to be addressing the root causes of climate change? I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, I don't think that, let's say, NATO should be concerned so much with the root causes of climate change. So let's say the mitigation question, we have to, let's say, get rid of fossil fuels and take all the other measures that most viewers will know. That's not for NATO. But let's put it the other way. I can't think of any major international organization in the world that will not be affected in whatever they do by climate change. So everybody should come to action. The only way that we can still avoid the worst impacts of climate change in the little time frame of 11 years that we have to roughly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by half. The only way we can do that is if everybody comes on board. And when you talk about the impact of climate change on security, you talk, of course, a lot about the adaptation side as well. So any military or security organization that is concerned about these issues, they should take action, because the conflicts will change. So let's say, take the Arctic, a well-known example. Suddenly all this ice is rapidly reduced and you have a completely new ocean to defend with some 8 countries around it that have their own issues and tensions. And on top of that, there's a lot of oil under there that people want to take out, which is not wise when you talk about trying to make this 11-year deadline. But it also means, if you look more at the human security level, just at the individual level, how many people, the well-known number is that in 10 years' time, the number of people without daily access to clean water will double from 700 million to 1.4 billion. If you just think about the impact that is going to have on the individual security of these people, but also they are going to move to the cities. How do these cities cope with this? Any organization that's involved with that has to deal with it. But that also includes, let's say, if you work at the stock exchange in Wall Street, you should also be worried about what's going on, because the massive change that we're going to experience in the decades to come is difficult to escape for everybody.
So that leads very nicely to another student question. Do you think it's time for the UN to reinvent itself in terms of addressing issues related to natural resource conflict? Unfortunately, some countries have called into question the organization's credibility. Wondering what's the role of the UN in addressing these issues, whether it's preventing or responding to or ending these conflicts?
It's been all of the above. If you look at the SDGs that were decided in September 2015, practically all of the SDGs are relevant for the issues of the impact of climate change on environment. Most directly, of course, in SDG 13 itself on climate, but also if you look at water and food and poverty. And that's the beauty of the Agenda 2030, that all of these things interact. And I just had a talk last Friday. I was honored to be invited by Helen Clark. She was in Stockholm, and she wanted to meet with me. So we had a long talk, more than an hour. And she says, of course, with her background and her passion for these issues, we should really focus on that poverty issue. 17 is really a lot. She said, when you're leading a government and you have 17 priorities, that would have been pretty difficult to run as a prime minister. So we spoke a lot about poverty. Now, of course, the poverty issue is highly related to climate change as well, and then automatically related to security issues. If you look at take what I predict is an average Sahel country, where because of, well, a lot of factors, but partly because of the drought and the increasing difficulty in predicting when you are going to get the little bit of rain that you have in that region, you see the impoverishment as there's less goats and cows in the herds. The people are going on the move. They are getting in competition for the little water that's left there between the agricultural farmers and nomadic herdsmen. These kind of complex, and I'm sure in the MOOC these kind of issues are discussed. They hit all the boxes that the UN should work on. So should the UN reinvent itself? Well, that debate is just as old as the UN itself, of course. Look at the composition of the Security Council. Look at the permanent five. Would you have, you know, a zero-based budget exercise and start again today? You would not pick these 5 countries to be the permanent 5, I guess. So reforming the UN is difficult. But I think within the system that we have of the UN, you see that it gets more attention. There were just these 3 positions created, where Sweden has lobbied for a lot, that in the UN headquarters, you have people that now are full-time responsible for looking at the relationship between climate and security. And they are in a position that they can make the right analysis, and they can feed it in the system that the right people react to it, and they can look at, are the different activities that are taking place in this massive UN, are they connected? Do they look at the problems also through the lens of environment and security? So I think small steps are taking place, and they're going in the right direction. I would say it's too slow. It should go much faster. Ideally, you should really have in the heart of the UN a huge group with specialists from many countries that can really focus on this and take more action. But UN never goes very fast in its internal changes.
I was curious if you could comment. You were talking about the SDGs. So I wonder if you could comment a little on the importance of SDG 16, because historically you've had the sustainable development world, an ECOSOC, and you've had the security world. And for the first time, really, in a global UN policy framework, there's a recognition that peace and security is an essential part of sustainable development, but it's pretty, let's say, underdeveloped.
Yeah, I think in a way it is less tangible than something as the old Millennium Development Goals, or something like some of the let's say the smaller numbers of the SDGs, things like poverty or so. It's more easy to measure or to quantify. Like I just mentioned with water, you can just say, you know, there's so much water, there's so many people, and that is of course with the, I don't want to call it the softer side, but let's say the things like peace is always more difficult to measure in numbers. But I think the beauty of the SDGs is that all of this is brought together, and that's a huge step forward from the Millennium Development Goals where we were, so that the whole sustainability element is now really ingrained into the system and also connected to peace and security. The question is, will this on the ground already make a difference? Well, at least it is now part of the thinking. It's part of the theory. It is in the policy papers. That's where you have to start. But I do fear a bit that the challenges that the climate change related effects that we are seeing now are now so rapidly developing. Every year I'm more shocked at the speed that we see change. I mean, look at just in the last weeks. I mean, here in America, you see in the Midwest, massive floodings, etc. You see what happens in Mozambique right now. You see, like every week, you see now these massive things. You see it back, and if you look at the damage that's reported by the reinsurance companies, you see worldwide that the damage of climate-related effects is rising exponentially. Can we even still insure the world after we have 2 degrees warming? That's an interesting question. And how will that impact our whole economy? Yeah, it's a good step. I'm very happy that it's in there. If it's enough, well, let's give it a chance. We'll see this year in September the first big review of the SDGs 13 and 16 and 17 in the week of 23 September at high level. So it's a good moment to see what we've reached and what still needs to be done.
And then we have another, I think, somewhat related comment from Bukunola Ayo. Actually, we have 2 questions related to climate change, more on the ground. Hi, with the different visible effects of climate change due to increased temperature, how can bush burning be stopped in Africa?
Oh, that's an interesting one. There are, of course, interesting initiatives taking place. Especially, I'm thinking of the green wall that is being built, which I believe is really impressive. But the bush burning is, of course, something that takes place on many different places, and it's much more difficult to control. And with increasing drought combined with higher temperatures, the regrowth of the bush will be much more slower and challenging. I think in these kind of cases, there's not like just one ready answer. There's not this silver bullet. It will be a combination of research, of education of the people that are living there, probably having the financial support might be needed. I mean, there's a good reason why people are burning the bush. They realize that it's not a wise thing to do because it's a one-time event, and and it can also be burning, of course, by natural. I mean, like forest fires that just happen. Ultimately, like many of these questions that we're talking about, the key issue is often governance. In anything climate related, you always end up with the massive challenges that we are facing in this rapidly changing world. The answer is always governance. And how can you locally increase the quality of governance? Of course, you should start at a global level. We have the Paris Agreement as a kind of first start. I guess a promising start. At least we could agree to do a first set of measures, but it's of course a tiny drip looking at a complete set of challenges. So we should continue to work globally on more cooperation. We should give more. We should help each other. The countries that have created practically all of the climate change problem, countries like where we are now or where I come from, I think they should take a much bigger obligation to help those countries that never contributed to the problem, but that are hit much harder by the problem, and on top of that have less capacity to adapt to these kind of problems. So I think we need more cooperation, and that cooperation should include strengthening government at the local level and give governments the tools that you can actually take action on these kind of problems. It can be bush burning, but also all kinds of other problems that are typically, let's say, the new problems that we are increasingly facing in the Anthropocene.
There's another kind of on-the-ground question related to climate change from a student. Do you believe the use of wind power in least developed countries would harm the natural flora and fauna of those areas?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, I mean, Of course, let's say if you put a windmill up, you might find a dead bird once in a while underneath a windmill. But it is, compared to the damage that you avoid by not burning fossil fuels and the massive impact that has on both wildlife as well as on deterioration of the quality of forest, etc. Yeah, those I'm very sorry for the few dead birds. People that follow me know that I love animals and that I don't eat them. But if you compare the advantages of moving to renewable energy with the price of a few dead birds, I fear that the ones that are paying so much attention to those few birds might actually be, some of them might actually have other intentions and try to keep us away from wind power so that they can still sell their fossil fuels. And that's with big respect for the bird lovers that really regret that some birds are dying there. But the numbers are not that extreme that should be our priority so much. We have to choose.
It seems like there are also opportunities to prevent or reduce the damage. There's some very interesting, innovative approaches to kind of keep birds away from areas.
With sound, maybe, or how did they?
So I remember seeing this. This was the landfill for San Diego, and it's right next to Miramar Air Force Base.
Yeah.
And seagulls love waste dumps.
Yeah.
You know, they come, they eat.
Yeah.
But you can't have them being sucked up into jet engines.
Yeah.
And the contract for the place says that if that starts happening, they can shut the dump down. So they tried all sorts of things.
Yeah.
They tried having dogs that chased them off. They tried having hunters that shot them. Those didn't really work.
Yeah.
What they wound up doing, they stuffed. Well, first they minimized the exposure. You know, as soon as it comes in, they cover it.
Yeah.
But then they had a couple of dead seagulls that they'd stuffed, and then they recorded seagull distress calls.
Oh, yeah.
And so seagulls get blown in off the ocean. They just keep flying. This is not a good place.
Yeah.
And so it's there are ways that you can reduce birds coming into certain areas.
Yeah.
And,
I wasn't aware of that, but that's great technology. If there are, let's say, warning signals of danger, if you could just broadcast them, etc., those kind of things. Yeah.
So there are ways that you can reduce the damage, but I think your fundamental point about looking at the big picture and that there might be some impacts.
Yeah.
What can we do to reduce them, and how does this weigh against the benefits?
Yeah. We also see interesting developments when on the continental shelf, if you put windmills at sea, that you see unexpected developments, that there's a kind of new wildlife that likes to live underneath the protection. Yeah. So you get all kinds of new wildlife habitats that people hadn't thought of before. So so that could be an unexpected positive benefit.
There's a student who's asking about, I suspect this is a practitioner student, what is the scope of funding for future environmental peace-building initiatives? Which countries, in your opinion, are interested in funding such initiatives, and why? I'm asking this question based on your experiences as a diplomat and as a policy advisor.
Yeah, my guess is that the countries that are most actively following environmental peace building initiatives and that are willing to be active there is Northwest Europe. That would be my first guess. So that could be Germany, Netherlands, Sweden. I mentioned those before, but also the other countries that are in that region. That's where I would expect the most chances to find funding for these kind of initiatives. The UK has been very active on all kinds of climate change issues, but they're
active with other things now.
Some other things on their mind. certainly in the next 10 days, I guess. Yeah, so in that area, I would look for funding opportunities with these countries.
The other question that they asked there is why those countries? Why are they interested in this? Or why not others?
Yeah, that's something I wondered as well. I would have expected that the countries that are actively involved in this debate that it would have grown by now, including for those countries that are much more impacted by, let's say, the security side of environment. I think what you find is that these are the countries that have a long tradition of being active from a global perspective, being active on development assistance. Those are often countries that were the first one to get active in recognizing climate change and developing policies. Look at Denmark with all their windmills. So when you had the energy crisis in the early 70s, Denmark at that moment decided, okay, we have so much wind here, let's just go for wind energy. And being a first mover, they now have the technology that they can actually market it in the rest of the world. That's often when as a country you rapidly step into new developments. It might be your advantage. In the Netherlands, it's maybe a more sad story. With 1953, we had this massive flooding. We lost more than 1,800 people, and like 1 million cattle were drowned. Huge parts of Netherlands, including where my house is, were completely underwater. But then in the 60s and 70s, we started an enormous program of building safer dikes and doing these huge waterworks. And that has now developed into worldwide expertise. So you find Dutch people everywhere. And now in days of sea level rise worldwide, the Dutch are highly in demand to use the knowledge that we've built up over the past century, and to help others doing that. So it's so it's typically something you would find in these countries, or maybe on the other side of the world. If you look at a country like New Zealand, is also very active on these kind of fields. But it's a handful of countries that picks it up, and I hope that that more countries get more active into this nexus of the environment and security.
Somebody was asking about commenting, the causal linkages between climate change and conflict are not fully understood, despite the general consensus that climate change can have negative effects on factors such as economic productivity and good governance, especially in developing countries. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges in addressing these linkages with effective policies?
Yeah, I think, well,
coming back to governance.
Yeah, it comes back to governance. I mean, one thing is research. I think on research we see quite a bit. There's many people in the world that are already active in researching these linkages and giving translating it into policy advice on what to do about it. You see that the climate security relationship has now been picked up by many international organizations. If you take, for instance, if you look at the European strategy, the old one I think was the previous one was I think 2005, and then 2016. 30 years later, we came with a new update. In the one of 2005, the word climate was literally not mentioned. I tested, I did like a search in the document. It wasn't there. It's all over the place in 2013. So it's research, it finds its place into policies. And yeah, now the key question is how do you implement those policies? And yeah, that's difficult. That's the biggest challenge, I think, to work on. Yeah, so it is that's very much the phase that we are in now.
there's, I think, a flip side to this question about how do you manage resistance. So talk about linkages between climate change and security. Do you find that most of your audience is generally receptive to your message? Do you ever counter opposition to your message? And if so, how do you manage that opposition? Do you push past it? Do you navigate around it? Do you engage?
Yeah. What I find is, okay, so very seldom, only in this country where I am now, I've seen pure climate change deniers that get literally angry at me saying that climate change exists. But that is a rare exception. I never see that in Europe or in basically in any other country. On the relationship between climate change and security, there's so many examples that you can give that it becomes a convincing story. I think the point of debate is much more in the field like, okay, now that we understand that, let's say, climate change leads to drought and then people go on the move and that leads to tensions because they go somewhere else. What the people are, those kind of, that's an easy story to tell. But okay, once you know that, what are you now going to do differently? And that is a challenge. And I don't think it's easy to answer. I mean, if you say we should, climate change is something bad, what are we going to do? Well, first and foremost, it is of course avoiding that we get more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So let's start to work on the problem. And there's a lot of other things that needs to be done as well. But that's like an easy answer. The house is on fire. We're going to put out the fire. That is our main priority. And then you can talk about a lot of other things, the rebuilding, etc., avoiding that you get more fires. But that is here difficult. If you say, apart from, of course, you start saying with the climate security relationship, the first thing is, of course, avoiding climate change. But then you come into face, okay, but we are there. There's already so much locked in. We're already at 1 degree. There's another 0.6 or 0.7 that's already locked in. And even if everything that we've promised each other under the Paris Agreement is fulfilled, we're already at 3 degrees. And we are not, again, in the country where I'm sitting, we are not we are not going to do everything that's promised. So we're in a much higher scale. So it will be a lot of talk about making people aware of the problem. Talk with all relevant parties what you can do about it. Take, for instance, going back to the example I gave like earlier in the talk, when we spoke about the Sahel and I mentioned these herdsmen and the sedentary farmers. I recently met a guy who came from one of the Sahel countries and works on making deals between the farmers that need the water and the herdsmen that have to pass through. And if you establish a communication and you can find some kind of compromise, well, they go through, the herd takes this route, uses that water on that day, and then they move on, and everybody is aware of what is going on. You can already relieve the tensions a lot. It is often about, it's pure diplomacy, not really between diplomats, but it's still the art of diplomacy. You bring people together, you start to understand each other's differences, and you try to find a compromise that everybody can live with. And in this planet where everything is growing, the population is growing, the consumption is growing, our problems related to climate are growing, the only thing that's not growing is this planet. It's getting increasingly tight here, and we don't have enough room to grow anymore. So we're very much in what the Club of Rome predicted in the early 70s. They said somewhere in the next 100 years, we're about halfway now, we're bound to get into trouble because there are limits to growth. That is exactly what we're in. But since we are still growing, worldwide, the economy is growing every year with a few percent, we will see more and more tensions. And on top of that, you bring in the whole climate change thing, you see that tensions will rapidly increase everywhere. And that's something I would love to see that the media would step more upon. Of course, sometimes you see good articles of a journalist that really goes to normally one of the countries in the south where the problems are most visible, and just describes on a local level what this really means. But we don't see enough of it because it's never a spectacular story with great pictures. It is often about, you know, this family got into trouble and then they moved. It's often on the individual level. But it is about millions of individuals. But they don't walk in a caravan that you can photograph.
Mm-hmm.
These are individual movements. But there's a lot of, you know, personal misery on the individual and the family level. And it is their, let's say, their human security that is difficult to grab in stories or to photograph or to put into graphs that people really recognize. So what does get attention is a massive flooding with thousands of people, you know, sitting on the roof of their house waiting for help because the picture is so spectacular. But I think the real impacts of the numbers of people that have where their life is ruined because of climate change, often you don't hear much about it. And that is something that, if I don't know if any journalist is watching here or people that write a blog, but focus more on those stories, get those stories out.
Seems like this goes back to a point you made earlier about certain things being easier to measure or to show, and those tend to dominate the narrative.
That's for instance on this one. This is an initiative, I think it's called Children Under the Sun, if I remember correctly, which is in Southern Africa, that focus on children brides, girls at the age of 12 or 13 that are married off. I particularly remember reading about Malawi, that are married off purely because their parents have lost their income because of climate change. And then at the age of 12, the parents just have to choose, like, we got like 3 children and we don't have enough food for our children. So we marry the girl of 12 to an older man so that at least we have enough money, enough food to feed the 2 younger children. These are horrible stories. And the numbers you talk about is just like, this is like hundreds of thousands of cases. And that utter misery that's taking place there, girls that are robbed of their education and therefore their future, and that will therefore, by the age that they are like 18, they have maybe like 5 children that all will have a bad future because the mother is not in a strong position. Those kind of processes have such a massive negative impact on hundreds of thousands of individuals, and those kind of stories should be more out there, so that governments and aid organizations can play into this.
I have one final question. It builds on something you were saying earlier, and then there's this all this analysis about climate change, but we don't necessarily know what's going to work.
Yeah.
And it seems like with a lot of aspects, a lot of the dynamics between environment, conflict, and peace, so much of our emphasis so far has been just on understanding the dynamic. And the solutions have been deductive. They have not been based on evidence. It's, well, now that we understand the problem, this is the solution, but where's the evidence to suggest that that's actually going to have an impact? And so it seems like there's a need, however we develop it, a need to build that evidence base really quickly on preventing or reducing or resolving conflicts around climate change.
I think we need, I think one of the things we need is more storytelling of, apart from all the research, etc., just stories of the positive stories where it has worked. And the answer is often not just one solution. It's often a mix of, actually here the SDGs are quite helpful. If you just tick off the 17 or the 169 boxes of the Agenda 2030, you can actually tackle these kind of problems, because it does address the poverty and the water and the food and the education. All these things work together. It is a complex issue, and But we have seen examples of where by working together and by taking the right measures, you can rebuild peace, you can rebuild stable societies. It's basically the story of peace building. That is, it's difficult to explain. It's not like building a bridge, you know. First there's no bridge, and then there's a bridge, and you can walk over it. It's so much easier.
And you know it's a bridge.
And you know it's a bridge. And peace is like, it starts already that if there's no peace, if there's war, it gets attention. If there is peace or building peace, it's less spectacular because you don't see it. But it's so much easier to make war than to make peace. Luckily, we have much more peace in the world than war. Much less war than we used to have in the past. If you go back to first half of the 20th century, the number of people dying in warfare, it's much less. So we are quite good at building peace. We're good in lifting people out of poverty, at least until now. I think now we are at risk because of climate change of losing a lot of that. We have a lot of positive stories. But I think the storytelling of how to do it, how in a situation where we have been at a risk of getting climate-related conflicts, but because of the right measures, we managed to avoid it. We need more of those stories. And then you can always talk about the evidence. You can never prove that if you had not taken those measures, that war would have broken out.
Yeah.
And it's just not how it works. War is a very unpredictable thing. We've been very bad at predicting wars in history. The First World War, we kind of coincidentally walked into it. Nobody was aware that we were going to have a world war. And there's many examples that followed it. But you can say there are a lot of indicators that conflict might arise. And if you're in time, it's always so much cheaper to avoid conflict instead of cleaning up the mess afterwards. It's costly in lives, but it's also costly in finance.
Well, Alexander, I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It's been very interesting, and I would like to thank everyone online for joining us and asking questions and engaging. With that, wrap up this office hour.
Okay, it was a pleasure. Thanks for the questions, and good luck with the MOOC.
Thank you.
Bye bye.